Hey David, thanks for joining me on this. For people out there in the YouTube universe, I don't, they may or may not know we had a reading together about a week and a half ago, something like that. And I wrote questions that I asked you then, and I'm going to ask some of the same questions because, I'm first of all, I'm lazy, and second of all, there are only like 20 people there. So let's let's broaden the audience. And then I added a kind of existential thing at the end. And then I also have a question that I got from I think his name is Yarrow. I ran into him again. He was at our conversation, but I believe he's the cinematographer on the Dennis Cooper, Zach Farley movie that your brother recently worked on, right?
Interesting. I know another Yarrow who came to my event in Northampton, but this must be a
Oh,
different Yarrow. That's interesting.
I've never heard that name before, so interesting. All right, well, we should get into talking about you instead of how many
Maybe
Yarrows.
Yarrow is orbit me in some way.
So sorry again for the, shoving the same shit in your face, but I think, this is a very interesting book, and I think people will be happy to hear your answers here. So, as I said to you a week and a half ago, you're the author of many books, including your newest novel, The Berlin Wall, which I'd like to focus on today. You're also the co-host of Wake Island Podcast, along with Paul Kwiatkowski, which is, in my opinion, the best thing out there. Better, much better than this. Engaging with contemporary alternative literature today. Thank you for having me on a few times. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you for saying that and for having me on here.
Yeah, yeah. So right, you and I first crossed paths a few years ago because Andrew Wilt at 1111 Press reached out to me when I was kind of in the first couple of years of learning animation, and he wanted me to do a little, I guess, advertisement for a chat book that he was putting out that would accompany your short story collection, Drifter. The chat book was called The Hate Room. And I first read The Hate Room because it was so short and I love minimalism. And I remember being immediately struck by the quality of your writing, which, again, I'm going to tell you is very much a step above what I'm used to seeing from the average small press publication.
Thank
Your prose has an elegant style. There's a focus on narrative that's often absent in contemporary alternative literature. You tackle themes of introspection, but also art, culture, and sweeping abstractions having to do with large-scale geopolitics filtered through a metaphorical horror that alters the physical landscape of the spaces your characters inhabit. And again, saying all of that still reminds me how difficult it is to describe your work. Um, so the question really has to do with whether you believe you work in genre or if you think you define genre, or better yet, just like what is the literary framework you find yourself working in? I remember vaguely what you said, but let's hear your new answer.
you. I'll try to say the opposite, whatever that was. Um, yeah, I mean, I would say maybe that I work with genre. Like I view genre as kind of different options or different opportunities to push ideas in different directions, but that there's not one genre that encompasses all of it. And I
Sure.
tend to think that like there's some ways that genre, certain works are written for certain genres for marketing reasons or, out of the interest of that author. But I think there's some truth to genre in that like certain feelings in life or certain actual experiences tend to have a certain genre aspect sometimes. Like certain moments feel like they have a kind of science fictional quality or a kind of horror quality or a kind of slapstick quality or, other kinds of comedic qualities. So I try to follow that in the writing process, like to think of the events in the book as actually happening. I think of my imagination as a space where they're happening, or maybe where they already happened. And the work of writing is to kind of record them or to reinterpret them or repackage them in a way. So I'm definitely open to genre. I'm not at all like allergic to it or trying to distance myself from genre, but I'm trying to be open in the sense of for each moment within the book, thinking of like, well, what is the genre of that moment? Not in terms of what should it be, but like what is it actually? I almost want to be kind of passive or reactive in the sense of letting the moment have the genre that it has and then going with that rather than saying, this kind of moment has to be expressed in this genre, or this other moment can't be expressed because it's not in the right genre. Like I don't want any of that because that's a limitation.
Sure.
It might help sell the book, right? But limitate, commerce is a limitation also, right? So I like the idea of, allowing the moments to feel like they're genuine moments and thinking of imagination as a real space rather than, just pulling it out of thin air. Like I don't really believe that you can make something out of nothing. So I tend to think that when I'm making something, it already is somewhere and I'm trying to like fuse it together or I'm trying to, tease it out so that it can exist on the page, but it already feels like it exists in a dream world or in an imagination or in the real world. I think a lot of what I do, which you got at already, is to like try to pick up on intimations in the world or like kind of, you could call it vibes or zeitgeist or like some kind of feeling that is really there in the moment and then crystallize it in symbols, in words on the page, but that have a kind of imagistic quality or that there's some aspect about the world that I'm making
Well,
that isn't exactly fantasy, that's connected to our world. Yeah.
let's talk about this some more because when I first saw this book come out, I mean I want to actually ask you a little bit about the way that this has been received by the public or even friends. Because when I first saw that you released a book called The Berlin Wall, and the cover, I believe, is just like a photo of the Berlin Wall or a piece of it, or some kind of like falling apart, like concrete structure. Um, it's not very obvious what this book is actually about because you could just assume looking at that on a bookshelf at a store that, oh yeah, this is like some historical thing about like the 1980s Germany or like the sort of clash of East and Western politics during that time. No, it's not at all.
Spoiler alert.
So, but this, from what you're talking about right now, I mean, this has a lot to do with, I think, political and cultural feelings in the world, at least for the past, let's say, 4 to 8 years. And well, okay, so I'm going to go back to the question I asked you during our conversation, and say one of the major themes of your novel, The Berlin Wall, is the idea that there's a lack of shared reality in contemporary culture, politics, etc. Um, that's obviously not a unique perspective. I'm willing to bet that most people alive today who have strong political or cultural beliefs have a feeling of being unable to reach across the aisle, politically speaking, on the grounds of their inability to agree on fundamental truths. However, your book is not a political diatribe. It carries no obvious ideology. Instead, you investigate this concept through the lens of another alternate reality, Europe in the year 2020, not afflicted by COVID, but rather a rapidly evolving geography reported on in a contradictory fashion depending on who is watching. The central premise is that some portion of the population believes the Berlin Wall was actually alive, as in made up of concrete and metal, but also living flesh. And through a kind of populist political upheaval, the wall may be coming back together. There's a particularly poignant moment in the book where a character named Uta, who is implied to have been a piece of the wall, but who now roams Europe like a nomad without a home, offers herself as a prostitute to a young, more or less right-wing man who finds great pleasure physically and ideologically in examining the concrete and steel beneath her skin. What led you to choose the Berlin Wall as a symbol through which to explore this concept? Because the book feels very of the zeitgeist, as you talked about earlier, but you're using this artifact from nearly 50 years ago to examine this rift in political and cultural consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I think rift is a good place to start of like the idea, that the wall initially represented a rift in the world, right, between East and West, or,
Right.
chips falling on either side in terms of how World War II ended up. And that rift, defined, let's say, the world of our parents, the world we were born into. And then, if you and I are millennials, and maybe most of our readers are millennials or people watching this, the fall of the wall was kind of the next rift, right? The wall itself being ripped up, defined the world we grew up in the 90s and, the early 2000s, which you could call like the post-wall era, right? Or the kind of American imperium era. And I started to feel, I actually wrote this book in 2018. So it being set in 2020 was like near future speculation rather than, revisionist history. But even in 2018 or 2015 or 16, you could already feel that that era was kind of ending, that post-wall era or the liberal era was kind of questioning itself and, was not long for this world. Something was going to happen that would either uh, perpetuate it, but make like a zombie form of it or a mockery of it, or something new would happen for better or worse, right? But you could already feel that that was happening. And I like the image. I always go back to images. I think I'm much more like image and atmosphere first. I think there's some writers, which I would consider myself more like this, who are kind of have like a cinematic view of the world where you start with an image and then you try to find words that evoke that image. And then there are other writers who have more of a poetic or musical view of the world where they start with words and then try to develop those words into something with meaning. In either way can work, but it's like wherever you start, you kind of have to work away from it, work toward the middle, let's say. So I definitely
Okay,
started with
yeah,
the image of
I
like,
sort of agree with that. Uh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. And you're kind of, it's one of those like two kinds of people in the world things. But because I think language is a double-edged sword, right? It's like, if you're writing a book, you have to use language, but it's like it has to be more than words, right? It has to like evoke feelings or images. So it's like you're going both ways, right? If you have the feeling and you want to write a book, you have to find the words. But then if you pick up a book, the words are all there, but it's only meaningful if it becomes a feeling, right? Or if it becomes an image or it becomes music or something that feels like it's beyond words. So I think it's very complicated when people say like there are certain things that can't be put into words. I might agree with that in principle, but I don't think they quite, I think when people say that, they don't quite give enough credit to the idea that there are some things that can be evoked with words, right? You're not exactly saying it. It's like you're planting that image in someone's mind.
Sure.
So to go back to an image, it's like when the wall broke down, I was born in 86, the wall fell in 89, but like for all intents and purposes, it's like one of the first global events of my life or of our life. Um, and so, living through the 90s was this kind of eerily triumphant time. And it was like, the end of history and the battles are won. And, America's kind of, its story about itself was that it's, ruling the world, but it's not an empire. And we're spreading democracy and we're sort of benevolently controlling everything, right? Always the narrative we grew up with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Underneath that, there was this feeling of horror, I think. Or I think like for some reason, everyone our age, not only now, but growing up, was like drawn to horror in some intense way. Like there was just some feeling that like something is wrong that they're not telling us, or something is wrong that they don't even know, there is no them, but it's like there's something in here, like something escaped from the fall of the wall that is like metastasizing or it's like turning weirder in the background around us. And I think I was just super attuned to that feeling as a child. I wouldn't have put it in those terms, but I could feel that there was something off, I think, even though I was being told that, we had defeated racism, we had defeated evil, we defeated whatever, and like everything was good and everything was great, and you could be whatever you want, and all these kind of like 90s pieties that now seem ridiculous. But at the time that was the party line. Uh, and I could just feel even then that like there was like a doth protest too much kind of thing, or like people were selling that idea too hard, and something was going to come back and bite us. So I think I just gravitated toward horror as a way of like not preempting it exactly, but just being in touch with that feeling in a concrete way. And so to come to this book, the idea that the wall, like that there's some battle in 2020 where the wall either is going to come back together, right? So the fall of the wall will be reversed or erased, and we'll just go back to the, you know, post-war era. That's one faction within the book wants to do that. And another faction of the book wants to like fully kill the wall, right? Or fully extinguish the idea that the wall was ever alive.
Hmm.
And both of those ideas are presented as kind of absurd and dangerous in different ways. And so the question of the book, which I think is the question of any artist, is like, as you said, how do you thread your way between ideologies? Because I think as soon as you become an ideologue for anything, even something good, maybe especially something good, you cease to be an artist, right? Like art has to question everything, or it has to be kind of oppositional to all orthodoxies, except itself. Like I do believe there's an orthodoxy of art, which means you have to just believe that that's worthwhile without questioning it. Because if you question whether that's worthwhile, you can convince yourself that it's not. Right. So you have to believe in a kind of zealous, almost fanatical way that art is worthwhile. But in order for it to be art, it has to not carry water for anyone else.
So you may have answered the final question I have for you, but I'm still going to come back to it. Before I get to the next one, though, I do want to ask Yaro's question because, as you're using this historical physical monument to be sort of the symbol for these ideas, Yaro was listening to our conversation, and particularly you talk about the Berlin Wall or read from the Berlin Wall. And he wanted me to ask you, are you a big fan of what is his name? Reza Negarestani, who
Mhm.
wrote Cyclonopedia?
Yeah, I have Cyclonopedia here, and I have we interviewed a guy who's friends with him, Jason Babak Mahajej, who's another like Persian contemporary Iranian American, Persian literary scholar. And so there's a world of that kind of stuff that I'm not super aware of, but I've read some of
Yeah,
Cyclopedia and a good amount of Mahajej, and we interviewed him. So I find that world fascinating, and the idea of like, you know, Gulf War and Iraq War being sort of patterned on these like eldritch, almost like Lovecraftian abominations, and the idea of current events. I know Nagarstani writes about literal oil a lot, but like current events being like oil seeping up from this ancient, underground reserve
yeah.
in sort of appearing on the surface of the world, but being this kind of ancient abomination is extremely fascinating. And in general, I like anything that takes, I mean, the word mystical is kind of watered down, but takes like some view of current events that's accurate. I mean, it's not like a fantasy,
Right.
but it sees something in them that's like the shadow beneath the shadow beneath the shadow of those things. And
My reading of that, and I picked up that book probably like 2011, 2012. It was very of the like George W. Bush era, and
yeah,
I don't think I finished it in its entirety because it's very dense and kind of like it written in this kind of like academic way, even though it has all this sort of horrific underpinnings and it's very Lovecraftian, like you said. But it seemed to me that the general concept was the West and not the East, like we're talking about, like communist China or Russia or whatever, but like the Middle East, right? And he was framing this more in terms of like Islamic extremism versus like Western capitalism, as like oil was this thing at the center of that was sort of driving the world towards like a kind of apocalypse or something, which I thought was fascinating. And when Yara brought this up in regards to your book, it seemed like you're also doing something with these really powerful symbols to talk about like these cultural rifts that are happening right now. So
and,
no,
and oil being literally what drives the world, like the actual
right,
act of driving coming from oil. Maybe one distinction, when you said it's that style tends toward the academic, and there's a world of that, scholars like that, like Mahashaj, who we interviewed, or Eugene Thacker, and there's a lot of people who have a kind of, connection to connecting horror to current events to like high level theory. And I almost feel like maybe the place where I diverge from that is like a similar interest in a similar, you know, appreciation for academic writing, but a desire to actually write in a much more accessible manner. I wanted the Berlin Wall to almost read like a thriller in a way, or going back to the
yeah.
concept of genre, that it almost has like a pulp dimension. But then hopefully, the more into it you get, the more you realize, that there are depths to it that weren't necessarily what you expected.
No, it is a novel, and it is an entertaining and pleasurable novel. And I appreciate that about your writing. I think I'm sometimes, well, Oh, here, I was going to say I'm intimidated occasionally by your work, but I literally wrote that down before. So let me just read this next question. Very, very impressed by your work, but also feel a bit intimidated in a way I've not really experienced when reading other authors in the small press scene. Just means like people in our age range. What I mean is that a lot of the contemporary writing, I'll include my work in this statement, has to do with introspection, self-pathology, and examining the culture only to the extent that it brushes up against our personal lived experience. I'm referring often to autofiction here, which seems to be the big fad of the past 20 years. But your work, especially the Berlin Wall, is concerned with large scale ideas having to do with political and cultural movements, and perhaps something beneath the consciousness of any ideological sect that allow these evolutions to take place. Further, you layer these themes with explicit body horror, but body horror that extends beyond the self. For example, an encroaching skin that takes over a home, a town, a continent. So I believe that most writers and artists start with a roadmap or mood board of influences from which they attempt to replicate and then hopefully ascend beyond. I've spoken at length about how I come from the de facto school of Brett Ellis, Dennis Cooper, and Joan Didion. It's very nice of Dennis to show up at our conversation.
That's fantastic.
Who, yeah, who or what sculpted this direction for you? I mean, we've just talked about Reza Negarestani, but it doesn't sound like he was on your radar as a kid. I know that you work with Chris Kelso on the David Cronenberg anthology, and like I said, his fingerprints are all over your work. But there's obviously something else going on here that makes your stuff feel a little bit more unique, and that just may be that you've been doing this long enough to have developed your own style. But yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always interested in the place where like an individual merges with something bigger, or where something bigger is like seen in microcosm in the individual. So the idea of, the skin covering the continent is one example, or the wall, which is not something that you think of as alive, growing skin or growing flesh and veins and everything. So certainly Cronenberg, I think in college I majored in mysticism and medieval mysticism. So I spent a
You're
lot of time.
serious? I didn't know
Yeah.
that. Okay,
Yeah, yeah. My major was called Esoteric Studies, Mysticism and Modernism in Western Thought.
love it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I read a lot of like medieval Christian and Jewish mysticism, some Islamic mysticism, but mostly Christian and Jewish mysticism about basically focused on that idea of like how can an individual, experience God or experience the divine or the transcendent. And I think it goes back to my feeling about writing, which maybe I do view in some kind of a mystical light. But basically, the idea that I've always been skeptical of groups, right? Whether it's, political dogma, religious dogma, a genre, a school of thought. I've always felt a kind of allergy to being in, I don't, it's not like I wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have me as a member kind of thing, but I've
Uh,
always been in the clubs, you know. On the other hand, I have never felt particularly, atheistic or nihilistic or disenchanted. Like I've always felt that there is some enchantment or that there is some enlightenment to be had, which might not be like a permanent knowledge, but that there are some experiences you can have that really do seem like they touch on another realm, but that might be within this realm. That the world itself is more than it seems, and therefore being a person is more than it seems. So a lot of my influences, other than these kind of medieval, religious writers, which was a more scholarly, I wouldn't say that they personally touched me, but they articulated certain ideas I was interested in. And someone like William James and a variety of religious experience, that was a big influence. But in terms of writers, at the event, we talked a lot about Bruno Schultz,
mhm.
who totally evokes that idea, right? That he created out of his own town in what was then Poland. He wrote in Polish, but is now Ukraine because speaking of the war, the border shifted, and he was killed by a Nazi officer. But he basically created this world of like a personal mythology in the just kind of run down and like decrepit world that he was living in, on the Eastern Front, let's say. And he was writing exactly at the same time as Lovecraft, who we already talked about, as Kafka, this is all in the 1920s and 30s, um, and Faulkner, right? So I would say those four are huge influences, all in the same moment. And Faulkner also, in his town in Mississippi, created this vast and kind of also degenerate but extremely spiritual cosmology out of like the rundown, backwoods world that he was living in Mississippi. And I think that idea is really important to me, is like mind as space. So thinking about literal spaces, if you take Faulkner, like Oxford, Mississippi, or what he then called Yoknapatawpha County, Jefferson, he made up these different towns. Um, but think of it as an actual space on an actual map, but that has this kind of otherworldly dimension, and I think the idea that you could find another world within this world is always the idea that has been most exciting to me and is what draws me to art, and I've always been wary of, the other world is elsewhere. That's like what various churches would say, you have to go to heaven or whatever, or there is no other world. That's the kind of like capitalist consensus of that we live in, basically, right? You should just
Right.
pillage this world as much as possible because there's nothing else, right? The sort of scientific materialist world, which has always been very unsatisfying to me, and to me feels untrue. Like I do feel there's something else here, like there is some magic here,
Yeah.
but it's like lost in a kind of decrepit, and a word I use a lot is seediness. And I love the idea of the seedy because there's a negative valence, right? Like we don't like things that are seedy necessarily, but there's also this sense of seed, of potential, of something that could grow, of something that could turn into something unexpected if you were to pay attention to it, or if you were to, see beauty in the trash, let's say, that other people don't see. And I think that's an aesthetic feeling. I like art that might be described as seedy, but it's also a kind of mystical belief that there, is unexplored potential in this world, and it has something to do with actual space. So speaking of writers, the writers I like almost always have a kind of spatial dimension. And one other person I'd add is Gerald Murnane, who's an Australian writer who's a contemporary writer, but does the exact same thing of, he's like I don't know if it's right to call him an autodidact, but he's a kind of hermit, like living in deep interior Australia, who basically all of his books correspond to the map of Australia, but in this incredibly strange and like cerebral and almost like synesthetic way, where he'll be like, off to the west, like storm clouds were gathering over the wheat fields, but on the right, it was my fifth birthday and I was remembering, and he has this strange way of like mixing his inner and outer worlds that feels like this very mystical pursuit. And that is the effect that I most love in fiction. And I guess is what I try to do also.
That's interesting. I may poke you about that author in the future. All right, well, let's get to something I haven't asked you before. Um, so I was looking for interviews with you online just to kind of spark my imagination here, and I read I think it's something relatively recent in X-Ray Lit Mag. You discussed the themes of your book and mentioned an aspect of the 2010s and 2020s that you call the unworkable equilibrium. In your words, this is the feeling that we're always on the edge of total collapse and abject horror, and yet never all the way over the edge, at least not in America and Western Europe. So the fear that we're on this edge might itself be the root of the problem. Are we pretending things are worse than they are, or denying how bad they've become? You then write, when you reach the end of your rope with this question, you could admit that you just don't know, which is in some ways more honorable, or you can latch onto just about any ideology, which can become the root of fanaticism. I'd love for you to expand on this to the extent that you feel comfortable, because I do feel like there is a split into two camps right now in both art and life, right? I mean, you're probably familiar with this slogan that gets tossed around quite a bit these days. All art is political. This is like one belief system. On the other side is the notion that aesthetics are vastly more important than ideology, and that an ideological framework is almost the worst way in which we can view our work or even the reality of our lives. I'm reminded of the Emile Cioran, how do you pronounce that guy's, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, yeah.
Emile Cioran quote that goes something like, We have convictions only if we have studied nothing thoroughly. Maybe this is a messy way of asking whether you believe it's even possible to form a fundamental point of view in the world you have mirrored in this most recent book. Um, and I don't know. Sometimes when people ask me something around this, I feel hesitant to talk about it because I think that, sometimes it's even not a good idea to discuss our politics in a public space. But there is like I don't know. We have to have some framework to go through life, right? And that can differ from the way we approach art. But I'm kind of curious. You've talked about this a little bit before that you're very hesitant to join any ideological camp. But does that mean this is all arbitrary, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not arbitrary. It's all trash imbued with mystic potential. So in a sense, right? Which is
That's
not
a
to say
great
that,
answer.
yeah, yeah, that's how I feel. I mean, which is not to say that you can't vote. You should vote. I mean, I think it's important to have some like real world relation to whatever's going on as much as you can. But I think would seek a third way, which is to say, one understanding of, all art is political is you have to, whatever they say, if you don't stand for something, you fall for everything, or, that you have to like explicitly model how you think the world should be, right? Or explicitly point the finger at who you think is making it worse. That's one idea. There's the idea of pure aesthetics, which I think is sometimes denigrated as a retreat, right? Or a kind of luxury, or, that you think you're above it all and you're going to just enjoy your aesthetic, right? Which I don't think people who genuinely espouse that are saying that, but that's what's said about them. But I think the third way, which is what interests me, is to say like you have to be engaged with the time that you're in. You can't choose when you're born, right? Going back to the happening to be born at basically when the wall fell. You can't choose when you're born. Can't really choose when you die, right? You could try to extend it. You could try to take care of yourself, but all you have is the times that you're in. And so my goal, which does come from a kind of mystical point of view, is to like try to seek eternity through the times that you're in, or try to understand like what does time, capital T, time mean? But you can only do that by actually paying attention to the times that you live in. Or to say like what is history? You can read history books, but am more interested in like what is the history that we're living through. And if you actually want to be open to that, you can't, put your thumb on the scale, right? You have to say like, not that I'm neutral in terms, like I have beliefs about things, but it's that from an artistic point of view, my belief is I have to, say thank you to the universe for anything that it puts on my plate, and just be like, okay, I'm going to chew this now, and like I'm interested in whatever it is, I'm interested, right? That's what it to me means being genuinely open-minded. And I think the same thing is true about being a person. And maybe relates to sort of the idea of autofiction or like what could be beyond it, is the sense that you only are who you are, right? You can't choose when you're born and you can't choose who you are. But you could try to investigate like what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be someone through trying to understand who you are? That to me is that third option. Like if you are only focused on your own specific circumstance, that could limit you in some way. But if you're totally indifferent to your own circumstance, you can't, that's like a non-starter, right? You have to like start, you are who you are. But I tend to believe through that there are insights into why the world is the way it is, and even what that is, how the world is, or how the human world is. You can only understand through trying to understand who you are. But that might not be as simple a question as some people might think it is.
Oh, absolutely. And I guess that same concept, like you can only understand how the world is by understanding the place and times that you exist in. I mean, I feel like that's very much what the Berlin Wall is doing. And it does not, and you sort of point out the value and sort of horror of both ideological camps that you've kind of like manifested in this alternate reality, but they mirror to some degree things happening in the real world with this like insane like fantasy horror thing going on. But I don't know. I think it was a great answer. I agree with you to large. Yeah, I guess I do agree with you. I don't know. I mean, we've talked about this stuff on a little bit on Wake Island. You talk about this in a mystical way. I've sort of have had my own like recent spiritual journey or whatever that's incredibly personal. And whatever. I don't know. Again, I still don't have anything I can sort of come to a conclusion with. It sounds like you're not either, but I like that investigation. Anyway, we have very little time left. We have about 4 minutes. I do want to recommend that everyone pick up this book. It is, can I say this is my favorite book of the year that's been published this year? I don't know if I'm going to go, I can't remember. I have like the memory of a goldfish, but at the moment, it would compete with the top three. I will say that. I was
Like it.
extremely, I don't know, surprised is the right word. I've read a number of your books now, and I'm blown away every single time. I highly recommend your work to anyone listening to this. So I don't know. Do you want to say anything else while we're still on?
No, I appreciate that. That's great. And yeah,
Okay.
thank you very much. And I think, yeah, I mean, the idea of not having a conclusion, at least in spiritual terms, I think is really important. That it's almost that's another third way that there's some people who are like, here's the conclusion,
Right.
this is what you have to do when you get to heaven or whatever. There's other people who are like not even going to step onto the path, right? Like the whole path is bullshit
Yeah.
and it's its own conclusion. But I think the middle path, or you can call it the mystical path, or just the personal path, or the artistic path, is to say that it's worth, working with these materials, right? Or worth estranging yourself from the world enough to see how strange it really is, without hoping to solve anything, but hoping to just render the nature of that strangeness in a way that is tangible, in a way that like people can see, oh yeah, the world actually is that strange. That itself is helpful. It's not a prescription for what to do about it. And maybe
Yeah.
there is what to do about it, but it's at least an ability to appreciate it for what it is in a way that might actually make people's life better if they could come to see the world that way.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, David, it's been a pleasure talking with you again. If you're able to make it out in New York, I'd love to see you in
Totally. No, I'm
a
planning
week.
to. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, well, we'll see what happens. We could, our points of view could be looked on in a strange way in about a month, given we'll see how this election comes. I'm not sure if this episode will be out yet, but
It'll be
the
interesting.
week the week that I'll be in New York is gonna be immediately after that. So I'm hoping that like, everyone's not fucking in the streets, but I don't know, maybe they need
God
to.
knows. Yeah. Yeah. Tonight's the big rally at Madison Square Garden. I guess everyone's in the streets now.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't go outside that much for at
Yeah.
least in places where things like that happen. So.
But it's like at Penn Station. Like if you were just taking the train, you would
Oh
be
shit.
you would be in
All right.
it. Yeah.
Well, I'm in LA. It's a very different thing. We don't fuck with public transportation, David.
It has its pros and cons.
All right. Well, I'm gonna email you to send me an author photo, and then
Okay.
yeah, I don't think this is gonna go up immediately, but sometime in the next couple of weeks.
Cool.
All right, man.
Fantastic.
Take care.
Appreciate it.
Have a good night.
You too. See you in New York.
All right. Bye-bye.